A chemist would be found dead at work, and police would determine that she was murdered, but they couldn't determine who murdered her. In fact, they believed it was a coworker. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. Geetha Angara had immigrated from India to the US. Geetha was a 43-year-old mother, wife, and chemist. In fact, she was incredibly well educated. She had several master's degrees, and she had earned her doctorate degree in organic chemistry at New York University. Friends and family would describe her as kind and caring and loving, incredibly educated. She was smart, she was funny. She was just everything you'd want in a friend, a wife, and a mother. Geetha was living and working in New Jersey. She was employed by the Passaic Valley Water Commission, and she had been there for nearly 12 years. In fact, she had recently been promoted to senior chemist. Geetha's job was basically to make sure that the drinking water for that town of 800,000 people was clean and safe. And of course, she took this incredibly serious. So in 2004, when she was given this promotion, the plant was transforming into this cutting-edge facility that would eventually dispense with chlorine treatments in favor of an ozone disinfection system. Her husband would say it was a very exciting time for her. The ozone technology was just coming up at the time, and she was taking the initiative and implementing it. She'd been promoted and had gotten her license to operate a plant. She was very happy. Her husband would also go on to say, "My wife told me that the atmosphere was very hostile at the time. There was friction. Apparently not everybody at the plant Geetha worked at was excited for her promotion. In fact, they were quite upset that she would be implementing these changes." On the morning of February 8th, 2005, Geetha would disappear while at work. Geetha was last seen going into the tunnel system at around 10:30 a.m. that morning. She was going through the tunnel system to work on the underground tanks. Coworkers would say that she was going down there to calibrate a system that controls the tanks, which was a normal job for her. She had done it plenty of times before, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The day went on as usual, except for later that evening, Geetha's family became concerned when she never arrived home from work. And it would be 12 hours from that point that anyone noticed Geetha was gone. A night shift worker would spot her coat and an uneaten sandwich in her office. Apparently at that point, 3 employees who had left for the day came back to work to search for her. So I do want everybody to be able to picture how Geetha's work environment was and what she was doing. So here's a really good passage to help. Interconnected tanks held 9 million gallons of purified water 35 feet deep. Those tanks had only one way in or out. Rectangular 4-foot metal access plates, each weighing 50 pounds, set in the concrete floor. So these employees, they come back to work and they're looking for Geetha. In a lower level passage, one of those employees found a broken glass, and it was pretty much adjacent from an access panel that was slightly askew. Apparently, this worker didn't think much of it, so they swept up the broken glass and threw it in the garbage. And eventually, after the employees were done searching and couldn't find her, they called the police. Security did discover Geetha's car was still in the parking lot. So Geetha had went to work one day, and she never left work, at least to nobody's knowledge. Eventually, a dive team was brought in to search those tanks. And remember, I told you that these tanks could hold like 1 million gallons of water. 30 hours after Geetha Angara had went missing, divers would locate her body in a tank containing 1 million gallons of water. And they said it had migrated from one tank containing 1 million gallons of water to another. Remember, I noted that an employee found a broken glass and that a hatch had been askew. In that section, divers would find a broken beaker. Remember that employee found some on the floor, they swept it up, they threw it away? Well, they also found remains of that in the water. They also found Geetha's radio. Investigators were quickly trying to determine what happened to her. They figured that maybe as she was walking, she was distracted and had fallen through the access hole that was left askewed. The problem was that access hole was nearly shut, and she couldn't have fallen through it. It was physically impossible for her body to fit down the hole as it was. Like I said, it was only partially skewed open, so perhaps even if she had walked over it, maybe her foot would just kind of go through, but the rest of her wouldn't. She couldn't fit down it the way that it was, which meant that perhaps somebody had put her in that tank. Investigators would quickly realize that this was going to be a hard crime to figure out. There was no cameras on the lower level, so they couldn't watch what happened. Then you have the 3 employees that were in there. They cleaned up some of the crime scene, whether intentional or not, who knows. And then police officers and firefighters were down there searching for her, so they contaminated it. And because her body had been in chlorine, very corrosive chlorine, for more than a day, they didn't have any physical evidence. There was no DNA, there was no fingerprints, nothing that could lead them to who had possibly murdered her. But an autopsy of her body would reveal that something violent had happened to her. This wasn't just an accident. There was deep bruising around her neck. There was bruising on her waist, on her elbow. Investigators theorized that she was fighting somebody that grabbed her, possibly from behind, and this person maybe beat her or threw her into a wall and knocked her unconscious. The prosecutor would say that they believe what happened is this person went down there, they attacked her, and then they pretty much haphazardly opened that little section, put her body in, and because they were in a rush, they didn't want to get caught, they tried to force it back shut, but they didn't shut it all the way. And possibly while she was being attacked, she dropped the beaker, the glass shattered, some of it got down the hole as they were shuffling her body down there. Knowing that the body showed signs of trauma and that this was definitely a murder and not an unfortunate accident, detectives began interviewing everybody at the plant that morning. In fact, they interviewed every single person at the plant, which was about 85 employees. And 3 of those employees did stand out as suspects. They would obtain DNA samples from 50 employees that had been there on that morning. The former chief assistant prosecutor would go on to say, there was a couple of people who raised their investigators' antennas, but when push came to shove, we looked into the additional things that became areas of concern in interviewing these folks. And based on that, we thought that while there were reasons they came across as hinky, we ultimately didn't believe they actively killed her. A year later, in 2006, an EPA dive team would go back in that tank where her body was discovered and do like a deep dive to see if any evidence was missed from the divers the first time. Again, this is a year later, and they found nothing. The autopsy would reveal that Geetha was still alive when she was pushed in that tank, but she was rendered unconscious before the body was thrown in there. And detectives knew that this place was a secure facility. It was very hard to get inside if you did not work there. So they knew that the killer had to be an employee or somebody who was in the facility at the time. This was a really small window of time to commit this murder, and they successfully did so without being caught. Detectives would also look at a 37-year-old case that had gone unsolved. It was just like hers, and they wondered that if a person from that plant had suddenly started working at this plant, but they could find no connections. As all of this is happening, the case is really growing cold. They don't have any evidence, they don't have any DNA, they have nothing to tie anybody to this case, but they do know they have a murder. And the family is very much frustrated at this point. They lost a wife, a mother, a family member, a friend, and nothing's being done about it. There's really no answers to what happened to her that day. In 2007, the state did agree to look at the case, but they didn't reinvestigate every aspect, and really nothing came of it. And then in 2008, a retired investigator for the prosecutor's office would say that this was just a terrible accident. He would say, there's absolutely no question in my mind. This retired investigator would basically cite the work of a Scottish pathologist who found that in certain cold water drownings, bruising would occur around the neck, similar to those of strangulation. But 5 pathologists reviewed Geetha's autopsy, and they all said this was murder. So even if the bruising around her neck could be explained away, what about her waist? What about her elbow? What about the broken glass on the floor? Where did all of that come from? The former prosecutor would go on to say, somebody in that place has some kind of responsibility. Either someone committed a homicide or someone forgot to replace that plate after opening it and now has this woman's death on their hands by negligence. And he would say that no one ever admitted to moving that plate. Geetha's daughter would go on to say, I think you would have to ignore a lot of facts to believe it was an accident. She would say that her mother was an exceedingly cautious woman. She took her job very seriously. And she said it was nearly impossible to miss a black 4-foot hole in the ground, especially somebody like her mother. Her daughter, of course, wants this case solved more than anybody. Since her mother's death, she's really stepped up to help take care of her siblings, and all this while she's attending college at Rutgers. And she's pursuing a career in the legal field, which is significantly different from her family, who's mostly in the medical field. Currently now, she's a government lawyer, and her job is to basically police state professional boards, and she brings action against nurses or doctors or pharmacists who are deemed a threat to the public. But really, what she wants most in life is justice for her mother. Currently, the family is still waiting for answers as to what happened to their mother. She went to work, she was doing the things that she had done on numerous occasions and was good at doing, and she ended up dead. The crime scene was contaminated, there was a broken beaker. It looks as if somebody attacked her and threw her in the water and then haphazardly tried to cover up the crime. In my opinion, this very much is not an accident. Even if cold water could make the markings of a strangulation, it still doesn't explain the elbow, the waist, the broken beaker, the way that the hole was covered. It wasn't done in a way that obviously it should have been closed. It was haphazardly done, meaning somebody may have been quickly trying to cover it. And the fact that it wasn't open enough for her to have just fallen in. How could she have accidentally fallen in if she couldn't have fit through it? I do believe that somebody attacked her, knocked her out, opened this hole that led to the water tanks, threw her body in as she was unconscious, and she drowned. And then, of course, they had to cover up the crime scene, so they're kind of closing this hole. Maybe they heard somebody coming, so they didn't have time to clean up the beaker. They didn't have time to close it all the way, and they just got out of there. And because her body was submerged in this highly chlorinated water for a long period of time, they didn't have any physical evidence. And then you have the contamination by police, firefighters, other employees. It just doesn't seem likely that they're ever going to be able to solve this unless somebody has a confession or a witness comes forward. So I'd love to know your theories on this case. Was it a horrible accident? Was she murdered? What do you think? But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.